They found the first body under the flower bed. In November 1988, detectives stepped into the tidy backyard of a pale Victorian house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento and started to dig. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains as shovels cut into soil that had always smelled of fertilizer and wet leaves. Within minutes, the sweet scent of flowers was replaced by something heavier, older, and wrong. When the shovel hit what looked like a tree root and peeled back a strip of gray, leathery skin, the kind old landlady who lived inside that house would never again be just a kind old landlady. This story begins long before that shovel, but it ends there. Back in the early 1980s, when the city center was full of people who had nowhere stable to go, 1426 F Street had a different reputation. It was the house that took you in. A two-story Victorian with peeling paint, a small porch, and a narrow yard. It looked tired but welcoming, like an aging relative doing her best to stay presentable. On the front steps, most days, sat a small woman with silver hair, thick glasses, and an anxious smile. Her name was Dorothea Puente. To many, she was just Dorothea. To some of the people who moved into her boarding house, she became Mom. She leaned into that role with practiced ease. Dorothea knew how to look soft. She wore loose dresses, cardigans, simple shoes. Her voice was gentle, her hands always busy with something domestic. Stirring a pot, arranging flowers, folding laundry. When a new tenant arrived, shaking from withdrawal, mumbling to unseen voices, or dragging a trash bag that held the last of their possessions, she met them with a steady gaze and a warm, steadying touch on the arm. "You are safe here," she would say. "You do not have to worry anymore." For people who had been worrying their entire lives, those words were almost unbearable. The city's social workers were exhausted. Caseloads were heavy. Shelters were full. Hotels did not want clients with psychiatric histories or open addictions. Families had long since given up or disappeared. Then there was Dorothea, offering exactly what they needed: beds, meals, and a landlady who could recite benefit regulations from memory. She spoke their professional language better than many colleagues. "She is a godsend," some of them said. Dorothea accepted the cases no one else wanted: the chronically mentally ill, the elderly with failing minds, the men and women who smelled like alleys and hospital disinfectant. She nodded seriously during intake meetings, asked detailed questions about medication and appointments, and always circled back to the same point. "Who manages their money?" she would ask. Sitting in cluttered government offices with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, she would explain that she could help. "Checks got lost," she said. "Vulnerable people were easy targets for thieves. Let the checks come to her address. Let her handle the banking." She would make sure rent, food, and medication were paid first. She had done it before. She knew the system. She wanted to protect them. It sounded sensible. It sounded responsible. It sounded like love. Inside 1426 F Street, life followed a quiet, repetitive rhythm. The furniture was old but solid. The curtains were mismatched, faded by sun and nicotine. The kitchen smelled of coffee, frying onions, and the metallic tang of well-used pots. Tenants shared bathrooms. They lined up for meals, shuffling in worn slippers that sometimes outlived the people wearing them. At the small dining table, Dorothea served simple food: soups, stews, casseroles with ground meat and canned vegetables. She did not eat much herself, claiming stomach trouble. She preferred to fuss over others, hovering with a rag to wipe spills, touching a shoulder here, a forearm there, anchoring her guests to the table and to her. On holidays, she decorated. Strings of cheap lights, paper napkins, a store-bought cake. She insisted that everyone sit together. Someone would put a radio on in the corner. For an hour or two, the boarding house looked almost like a normal family home. From the sidewalk, passers-by saw a series of blurred snapshots. An old man smoking near an upstairs window, smoke drifting out into the street. A woman with a walker, slowly easing herself down the stairs, while Dorothea hovered at her back. A cluster of men on the porch, staring at the traffic, plastic bracelets from recent hospital stays still clinging to their wrists. Nothing about it screamed danger. If anything, it radiated weary compassion. That image protected Dorothea better than any lock. Every new arrival meant new paperwork. In the cramped front room, at a scratched wooden table, Dorothea spread out documents like a dealer spreads cards, identification cards, Social Security letters, disability determinations, benefit amounts circled in red ink. She offered to write to agencies, to correct records, to fight for back payments. All she needed, she explained, was permission. Just sign here, and here, and here. Some of them could barely read. Some of them were too tired to try. The pen scratched across the paper anyway. With each signature, another life's income flowed through her hands. She kept meticulous notes of who received what, when, and for how long. The ledger in her mind was sharper than any pity in her heart. Outside, the city roared. Cars, sirens, distant freight trains, children on bicycles. Office workers hurried past 1426 F Street with coffee cups in hand, barely glancing at the sagging porch. For them, the house was just another old building on another old block. For the tenants, it was the end of the road. In that world, people vanished all the time. Some relapsed and disappeared into alleyways and shelters. Some were picked up by ambulances and never came back. Others drifted toward other cities, other programs, other temporary miracles. When someone at the house stopped appearing on the porch, there was always an explanation waiting on Dorothea's lips. He went back to his family, she would say gently. She found a place closer to her doctor. He got a job. She wanted a fresh start. The stories were simple, tidy, and impossible to verify. A neighbor, watering plants, might pause and frown, trying to remember when she had last seen that tall man with the nervous laugh. A social worker, dialing a disconnected number, might feel her stomach twist for a moment before she filed the missing client under unreachable. A mail carrier, sliding envelope after envelope with government seals through the front slot, might idly wonder how many people actually lived inside. Then the moment would pass. The city had other emergencies. Meanwhile, the yard behind 1426 F Street stayed strangely busy. Dorothea liked to garden. At odd hours, she moved dirt around, planted new shrubs, extended flower beds. The soil turned and settled, as if the earth itself were restless. No one paid close attention to what exactly she was burying. For now, in this first chapter, all of that horror is still hidden. There is no police tape around the property yet, no television vans, no tourists whispering on the sidewalk. There is only a tired woman on a porch, a line of broken people shuffling through her front door, and a city grateful that someone is willing to take them in. The shovel has not yet hit the first body. but it will. By the time anyone started asking where Bert was, he had already been gone for weeks. On paper, his name was Alvaro Montoya. In real life, most people called him Bert. He was in his early 50s, deeply mentally ill, with a history of homelessness, and a face that could shift from childlike confusion to sudden panic in a heartbeat. Voices chased him through the streets of Sacramento. Sometimes he argued with them out loud. Sometimes he tried to outrun them and ended up talking to parked cars instead. He did not trust many people, but he trusted his social worker. Her name was Judy. She had seen too many clients disappear into alleys and morgues, too many empty chairs at appointments that were supposed to change lives. When she first met Bert, his hair was wild, his clothes filthy, his hands trembling. He smelled like sweat, fear, and the inside of shelters. He also smiled when she remembered his name. That was enough for her to fight for him. For months, Judy tried to find a stable place willing to take him. Most boarding houses said no as soon as they heard the words, severe mental illness. They wanted quiet tenants, tenants who would not scare the others or disrupt routine. Bert talked to people who were not there. He woke up screaming. He forgot where he was mid-sentence. On a checklist, he was a walking red flag. Then Judy heard about 1426 F Street. Dorothea takes the hard cases, someone told her. She has a good heart. She understands people like Bert. She handles their money, their meds, everything. It sounded almost too perfect. Still, Judy picked up the phone. On the other end of the line, a gentle, slightly quavering voice answered. Dorothea introduced herself, and within minutes, she was saying all the right things. Of course she would take Bert. Of course she was comfortable with mental illness. Of course she could supervise medication. She mentioned other clients she had cared for, talked about holiday dinners and group outings, about the joy she felt seeing people come back to life under her roof. Judy wanted to believe her. Bert needed her to believe. The day they brought him to 1426 F Street, the old Victorian looked almost friendly in the afternoon light. The porch sagged a little, but there were potted plants near the door. The curtains were clean. A faint smell of cooking drifted out when Dorothea opened the door. Onions, coffee, something like stew. She greeted Bert by name, as if she had known him for years. "There you are," she said, reaching for his hand. "You must be tired. Come inside. This is your home now." Bert hesitated in the doorway. The house was dim after the bright street. He looked back at Judy, eyes wide, as if silently asking whether this was really safe. She nodded, trying to ignore the weight in her own chest. "You are going to be okay here," she told him. "Dorothea will take care of you. I will still see you. We will do this together." Inside, the air was thick with old fabric and cleaning products. Dorothea led them down a narrow hallway, past faded pictures, and a small shelf crowded with religious figurines. The room she showed Bert was basic but clean. A bed, a dresser, a small window facing the side of the house. There was a glass of water on the nightstand, and a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. "It is not much," Dorothea said, "but it is safe. That is what matters, yes?" For someone who had been sleeping in doorways, it looked like a palace. They sat at the kitchen table to go over paperwork. Judy watched as Dorothea moved confidently through the forms. She knew every acronym, every line for representative payee, every trick to speed up benefit processing. Bert fidgeted, eyes tracking every movement, but he signed where he was told. We will make sure your money is used correctly, Dorothea said, her voice soothing. No one will take advantage of you. In that moment, Bert believed her. Judy wanted to believe her. The system around them needed someone like her. For a while, things looked better. When Judy visited, Bert seemed calmer. His clothes were cleaner. He had regular meals, a bed, a routine. He talked about the other tenants in clipped, disjointed phrases. But there was a new thread of stability in his stories. He always mentioned Dorothea with a kind of reverence that made Judy uneasy and relieved at the same time. Grandma Dorothea, he called her once, almost proudly. Still, small things nagged at the edges of Judy's mind. When she asked Bert about his money, he would parrot phrases that sounded rehearsed. Dorothea takes care of it, he would say. She knows what to do. She is good with the checks. When Judy asked Dorothea about the same thing, the answers were smooth and detailed, but somehow too smooth. He is not capable of handling his finances, she would say. I keep strict records. Every penny goes to his needs. If you like, I can show you the ledger. Judy never had time to sit and look. There were always other clients, other emergencies, other fires to put out. Then Bert missed an appointment. At first, Judy was not alarmed. Clients missed appointments all the time. Maybe he had overslept. Maybe he had mixed up the day. She called the house. No answer. She tried again later. This time Dorothea picked up. "Oh, Bert is not here, dear," she said lightly. "He went to visit family. In Mexico." Judy froze with the phone pressed to her ear. Family? In Mexico? Bert had never mentioned relatives outside the country. He barely mentioned relatives at all. "Did he tell you that?" Judy asked. "Of course," Dorothea replied. "His brother-in-law came for him. Very sudden. But it is good for him to be with family. He was so happy to go." The conversation left Judy with a cold knot in her stomach. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting. People disappeared. Families appeared out of nowhere when money or guilt or nostalgia pushed them to act. Maybe this was just one of those cases. But the knot did not go away. Days passed, then weeks. Bert missed every appointment. He did not call. He did not show up at drop-in centers. No other agency reported contact. Judy called 1426 F Street again. This time, the story had changed slightly. "Oh, they decided to take him to Utah," Dorothea said. "Yes, Utah. They have a program there. Better for him. Do not worry." Judy hung up the phone with her heart pounding. The details felt wrong. The confident way Dorothea shifted the story felt worse. A man as fragile as Bert had supposedly crossed borders, moved states, enrolled in a new program, all without a single signature or phone call involving his social worker. Something snapped into focus. Judy did what overworked, overloaded workers sometimes quietly dread. She filed an official missing person report. On the form, she wrote down Bert's full name, his diagnoses, his last known address. Under, "Why do you believe this person is missing?" she tried to condense a creeping, bone-deep instinct into a few lines. Because he would not just disappear. Because the stories do not add up. Because I am scared I sent him to the wrong place. That report was the first small crack in the mask of 1426 F Street. Soon, detectives would walk up those front steps with polite smiles and hard questions. Dorothea would meet them at the door, playing the frail, confused grandmother. She would talk about her poor, troubled tenants and her life of sacrifice. She would offer them coffee. She would swear she had nothing to hide. And in the backyard, under the turned earth of her garden, Bert was already waiting. The first time Detective John Cabrera walked into 1426 F Street, nothing about the house screamed mass grave. He had come because of a missing person report, not a murder case. On paper, he was looking for one man, Alvaro Bert Montoya, a vulnerable tenant whose social worker was making more noise than most. As he stepped onto the crooked porch, he could already hear the TV murmuring from somewhere inside, the familiar hum of a house where people sat and waited for days to pass. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately. There she was, small, gray-haired, glasses perched on her nose, a cardigan wrapped around narrow shoulders. Dorothea Puente blinked up at the detective with a mix of confusion and concern, like someone's grandmother who had just been woken from a nap. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice soft. Cabrera introduced himself and mentioned Bert's name. At that, Dorothea's expression shifted into a carefully prepared sadness. "Oh, Bert," she sighed. "Such a troubled soul. He is not here anymore. He went with family. They came and took him. I told the social worker." It was almost the same story she had told Judy. Only now, told to a homicide detective, the little cracks were easier to hear. "Family from where?" he asked. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, the smallest skip in an otherwise smooth performance. "From out of state," she said. "Utah. They wanted better care for him there. Can you give me their names, a phone number, an address?" Cabrera's voice stayed polite, almost gentle. Dorothea fluttered her hands, apologizing with her body. "Oh no, I do not have that. They were in such a hurry. It was very sudden." Behind her, the house groaned softly in the heat. Somewhere a floorboard popped. The smell of the place pressed in. Dust, cooking oil, cleaning chemicals, something else underneath that he could not yet name. Cabrera stepped inside. The hallway was narrow, lined with cheap framed pictures and religious icons. The living room held mismatched chairs, a TV, and a few tenants who stared at the detective with a mix of curiosity and dull indifference. Some looked away quickly. Others held his gaze for a second too long, as if silently weighing whether he was someone they could talk to. He noticed details. The tenants' clothes were clean but worn. Their movements were slow, medicated. Their eyes were clouded by more than age. On a low table, pill bottles sat in a neat row, labels facing outward. In the corner, a stale draft carried a faint, sour note that did not quite match the rest of the house. "Do you mind if I take a look around?" he asked. Of course, Dorothea said quickly. "I have nothing to hide. These poor people, they have nowhere else to go. I do my best." She led him through the house, talking nonstop, about her work, about her sacrifices, about how hard it was to care for people everyone else had given up on. Her voice wrapped itself around the story, trying to smother any doubt before it could fully form. Cabrera listened. He nodded, but he kept looking. He saw a small framed certificate on the wall, something about community service. He saw a stack of mail on a side table, envelopes from government agencies, all addressed to different names but the same address. He saw a tenant flinch slightly when Dorothea's hand brushed his shoulder. A flinch so quick most people would have missed it. When he asked about Bert's room, she led him to a door down the hall. "He stayed here," she said, opening it. The room was sparse: a bed, a dresser, a chair, no personal photos, no clothes hanging in the closet, no random clutter that usually accumulates in places where people live, even for a short time. If someone had truly left in a hurry, there should have been something left behind. A sock, a magazine, a receipt, a crumpled note. The emptiness felt staged. "Did he take all his things with him?" Cabrera asked. "Yes," she replied without missing a beat. "His family brought a big suitcase. They took everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes behind the glasses were watery, earnest, almost pleading, the perfect picture of a woman unfairly questioned. He walked to the window, looked out over the backyard. From here, the garden looked wrong. The soil was uneven, patched with darker rectangles, where the earth had clearly been disturbed. Some areas were covered with planks, others with concrete squares that looked newer than the rest of the yard. Flies traced lazy circles in the air above certain spots, even though there was no visible trash. "Do you do a lot of gardening?" he asked. "Yes," she said quickly. "I love my garden. I grow vegetables for the tenants. It is my pride." His eyes followed the lines of the soil. Patches dug, patches filled, patches hardened. Back in the living room, he sat down with a few of the tenants. Dorothea hovered in the doorway, smiling too much. "When was the last time you saw Bert?" he asked one man. The tenant frowned, thinking hard. "A while," he said slowly. He was here. Then he was not. She said he went away." "Did you see anyone come pick him up? Family? A car?" The man's face clouded. He glanced nervously toward the doorway, where Dorothea still stood, pretending not to listen. "No," he said finally. "I did not see." In another chair, a thin woman with trembling hands whispered, barely audible, "People leave here all the time." Her eyes met Cabrera's for a second. There was something like warning in them, or maybe a plea. Then she dropped her gaze to the floor. By the time he left the house that day, Cabrera did not have proof. He did not have a confession, a weapon, a witness ready to stand in court. All he had was a missing man, a too helpful landlady, and a backyard that felt like it was holding its breath. Sometimes that is enough to keep a detective awake at night. He went back to the station and started pulling strings. He looked up Dorothea's history and found more than he expected. Fraud, forgery, theft, prison time, parole. Not the clean record of a selfless caregiver. He checked financial records and saw benefit checks still being cashed in the names of people no one had seen in months. He talked to neighbors. They told him about the smell. It was not constant, they said. It came in waves. A thick, sweet, rotting odor that seeped into open windows and clung to curtains. Sometimes they blamed it on the river, sometimes on garbage, sometimes on old pipes. When they complained, Dorothea blamed her fertilizer, fish emulsion, or a broken sewer line she said she was trying to fix. "And those holes," one neighbor added. "She had guys out there, convicts or something, digging trenches, then filling them in, then digging again. It was strange." Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Finally, Cabrera went back to 1426 F Street with a simple request. "I want to take a look in your yard," he told Dorothea. "You understand how it is. We have to rule things out." She hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she nodded and gave a tight little smile. "Of course," she said. "Go ahead. I have nothing to hide." Out back, the air felt heavier. The roses along the fence drooped slightly, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. The soil was mottled, scarred by past digging. The detectives fanned out, shovels in hand. The first few minutes were just the ordinary sounds of metal biting earth, the scrape of rocks, the grunt of effort. Then one shovel hit something that was not rock. The earth gave way with a wet, tearing sound. A smell rose up, thick and sickening, forcing everyone to step back instinctively. One detective gagged. Another swore under his breath. Cabrera stared at the dark shape emerging from the dirt. It was not a pipe. It was not a root. It was a human leg. The day after they found the first leg, the backyard of 1426 F Street stopped being a garden and became a crime scene. Yellow tape went up around the property line. Patrol cars blocked off the street. Neighbors who used to walk past without a second glance now stood in clusters on the sidewalk, arms folded, eyes locked on the back gate. The smell of wet dirt and something far worse rolled over the fence in invisible waves. Reporters were not there yet. For the moment, it was just officers, detectives, and the quiet horror of realization settling onto everyone who stepped onto that ground. Detective Cabrera stared at the exposed limb, trying to force his mind to stay clinical. The leg was wrapped in stained cloth, the skin waxy and collapsing, the shoe still on the foot. In his line of work, he had seen bodies before. Shooting victims, stabbings, overdoses. But there was something different about a body pulled from the earth in someone's backyard. It meant someone had planned for that body never to be found. "Secure the area," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "No one in or out unless they are supposed to be here. We are calling the coroner and crime scene. And keep an eye on the house. Because inside that house, staring through a window with a look of wounded confusion, was Dorothea Puente. When they had called her out to the yard and shown her what the shovel had hit, she had reacted like a woman watching someone else's nightmare. Her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is that? What is that?" "You tell me," Cabrera had said. She had shaken her head, insisting she knew nothing, that workers had dug in the yard before, that there was an old septic tank, old pipes, maybe an animal. She did not know. She was just a landlady, a poor old woman trying to help people no one else cared about. Now she sat in her front room, small and hunched, while the police outside prepared to tear her sanctuary apart. Inside, some tenants had been moved to another area. Others wandered, dazed, trying to understand how the place that gave them a bed and a routine had suddenly turned into the center of something much larger and darker than their personal struggles. In one corner, the thin woman with trembling hands, who had whispered, "People leave here all the time," sat with her head down, eyes fixed on the floor. Every few seconds, she flinched at the muffled thud of shovels hitting earth. "Do you think it is them?" another tenant asked hoarsely. She did not answer. She did not have to. Outside, the digging resumed. This time, it was slower, more methodical. Crime scene technicians in protective suits moved alongside detectives, marking the ground with flags and taking photographs before each new cut into the soil. The sky above Sacramento was a bright, indifferent blue. The second body part surfaced an hour later. It came out in pieces, wrapped, twisted, clinging to clods of dirt and roots. Someone cursed under their breath. Someone else turned away and threw up behind the shed. The smell thickened, wrapping itself around everyone with a suffocating grip. "Another one," a tech called out, voice flat with disbelief. "We have another." Word spread quickly through the house, through the block, through the station. This was no longer a missing person case. This was no longer even just Bert. This was a burial ground. In the kitchen, an officer sat across from Dorothea, who clutched a tissue in one hand, like a prop. She had agreed to answer questions while they worked outside. She had no choice, really. Leaving would have looked worse. "I do not understand," she kept saying. "I do not understand what they are finding. I have lived here for years. I help people. I feed them. I take care of them. I am not a monster." She dabbed at the corners of her eyes, careful not to smear her glasses. "Do you know how many people have stayed in this house?" she demanded suddenly, as if the weight of her supposed generosity could counterbalance the dead in her yard. "Do you know how many lives I have saved? And now you come here and treat me like this?" The officer did not answer directly. He asked about specific tenants, names, dates, the last time she claimed to have seen them. Every time a name was spoken, a shadow crossed her face, quick and involuntary, before she smoothed it away. "I helped them," she insisted. "They left. They moved on. People come and go. You cannot expect me to keep track of everyone forever." But outside, the earth was doing exactly that. By midday, the coroner's team had called in additional help. Body after body emerged from shallow graves, some intact, others reduced to fragments. The number climbed, 2, 3, 4. Each time they uncovered a new shape, the officers around the pit fell quieter, as if their voices might disturb the dead. Cabrera stood at the edge of the largest hole and felt his stomach twist. He thought of Judy, the social worker who had trusted this house. He thought of Bert, who had walked through that door believing he had finally found safety. He thought of the neighbors who had smelled something wrong and had no words to describe it. "How many do you think there are?" a young officer murmured beside him. Cabrera did not answer. He could not yet say 7 or 9 or more. All he could say for certain was this: whatever number they reached, it was already too high. The first news truck arrived in the early afternoon. Word had leaked. It always did. A tip passed from scanner to newsroom. A rumor on police radio. A neighbor calling a local station. Soon cameras were rolling on F Street, capturing shots of white-suited figures moving in the yard, of black body bags being carried, of a small, ordinary house at the center of something that would burn itself into the city's memory. Inside, someone turned on the television. Within minutes, the tenants saw their home on the screen. They saw the front door they used every day, the porch where they smoked their cigarettes, the windows they had stared through on long, sleepless nights. They saw the words scrolling across the bottom of the broadcast. Possible mass grave. Boarding house. Investigated. One man began to shake, his teeth chattering. Another pressed his palms over his ears, rocking back and forth. A woman started to cry, not loud, but steadily, like a leak that could not be stopped. In the front room, Dorothea watched herself appear on the screen in an old photograph, smiling beside a group of people whose faces were now, possibly, being pulled from the dirt outside. She did not cry then. Her expression hardened, just for a second, before she remembered to look fragile again. The legal machinery was grinding into motion. Warrants were being expanded, records requested, bank statements pulled. Every name attached to 1426 F Street in recent years would be combed, cross-checked, compared against the bodies being exhumed. But in that moment, in that house, the horror was still intimate. These were not just victims. They were the man who always asked for extra sugar in his coffee, the woman who hummed to herself in the hallway, the quiet tenant who sat near the window and watched buses go by. People whom the world had learned not to see now being seen in the worst possible way. As the light began to fade, floodlights went up over the yard. Work would continue into the night. The earth did not care about human schedules. Before they took Dorothea downtown for formal questioning, Cabrera stood in the doorway and looked at her one more time. The grandmother act was still firmly in place, but around the edges he could see the strain, the tightness in her jaw, the calculation in her eyes. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze without flinching. "I have not killed anyone," she said. Outside, the bags carrying her tenants told a different story. When the ground finally stopped giving up bodies, the number was 7. 7 people who had gone missing without triggering sirens. 7 lives reduced to case numbers, bones, and the question that echoed through every headline: how did a little old landlady turn her backyard into a cemetery without anyone stopping her? The answer did not come quickly. It came in court. After the discovery on F Street, detectives did what detectives always do. They followed the money. Bank records showed disability and Social Security checks still being cashed long after tenants were supposedly with family or in better programs. Witnesses came forward with memories that suddenly seemed sinister. The strange smell, the constant digging, the way Dorothea always seemed to know exactly when someone's benefits would arrive. And then there was the escape. Because in the chaos of that first day of digging, while officers were still figuring out how many bodies lay under her garden, Dorothea Puente had done something that, in retrospect, looks almost absurdly bold. She had walked out of her house, told an officer she was going to get a cup of coffee around the corner, and simply never come back. For a few hours, no one realized she was gone. By the time the mistake became clear, she was already another face in another city, checking into a cheap motel in Los Angeles under a false name, wearing a long red coat that made her look like a grandmother on a bus trip, rather than the center of a growing mass murder investigation. On television, her real face was everywhere. News anchors repeated her name, showed her glasses, her cardigan, the house on F Street. The words "suspected serial killer" were now attached to a woman who had once been described in social work files as a caring provider. The image was so jarring that people could not stop looking. One of those people was an older man sitting in a bar near Skid Row. He struck up a conversation with a quiet, polite woman, sitting alone, a woman calling herself Donna. She said she was a caretaker. She said she helped people. She asked a few too many questions about his pension, his benefits, his life. There was something about her that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Later, in his motel room, he turned on the news. The face on the screen, the glasses, the small mouth, the careful smile, was the same face he had just been sitting across from. Only now, the name underneath it was different. Dorothea Puente. He called the station. The reporter called the police. When officers knocked on the motel door, Dorothea opened it calmly, as if she had been expecting them. She wore that same red coat. Cameras caught her being led out in handcuffs, head down, as reporters shouted her name. She did not answer them. She never answered much in public again. Back in Sacramento, the narrative was shifting from kind landlady to predator. Prosecutors began to piece together a timeline that stretched back years, even before Bert, to earlier deaths tied to Dorothea. A boyfriend whose body had turned up dismembered in a river, a friend who had died suddenly in one of her rooms, others whose paperwork and money had conveniently flowed through her hands. By the time the case went to trial, the list of suspected victims had grown to 9. The trial did not happen in Sacramento. There was too much anger there, too much saturation. It was moved to Monterey, hours away, in the hope of finding jurors who had not already decided what they thought of the gray-haired woman accused of turning human beings into income streams and garden fertilizer. In the courtroom, Dorothea looked, as always, like someone's grandmother. She wore simple dresses, her hair was neatly brushed. She listened to testimony with a blank, almost bored expression, as if she were watching a television show she had already seen. The prosecution did not have a dramatic eyewitness who had seen her dig a grave at midnight. They did not have a confession. What they had was something colder, and in some ways more damning: patterns. They showed that her tenants were alive, receiving benefits, and under her care, until suddenly, the only thing that remained of them on paper was a check with her address on it. They showed that every time a body turned up, it was someone whose income she controlled. They brought in experts who described the drugs found in the victim's systems, the lethal combinations of sedatives and other medications that would have been easy to disguise as compassion in a house full of pills. She poisoned them, the prosecutor told the jury, slowly, quietly, in a way that made it look like natural decline. Then she buried them and kept cashing their checks. For weeks, witnesses filed in and out of the courtroom. Neighbors who remembered the smell, tenants who had escaped, social workers like Judy who wrestled with guilt under the weight of hindsight. Detectives described the yard, the digging, the moment the shovel hit the leg. Judy sat in the gallery one day as they showed a photograph of what had been found in that dirt. She looked down at her hands, knuckles white, and had to remind herself to breathe. On the other side of the room, Dorothea did not flinch. Her defense team tried a different story. They painted her as a flawed but generous woman who had dedicated her life to caring for the unwanted. They argued that the people in her house were medically fragile, that they could have died of natural causes. They suggested that others might have been involved, that Dorothea was being made a scapegoat because she was an easy symbol, the evil grandmother. When it was finally her turn to speak in her own defense, she kept it short. "I have not killed anyone," she said. "I have always tried to help people who no one else would help." It was the same line she had used in her living room, while the yard outside gave up its dead. The jury deliberated for an agonizingly long time, 24 days. It was, at the time, the longest deliberation in a murder trial in California history. Behind closed doors, the jurors argued about evidence, motive, reasonable doubt, the weight of patterns versus the absence of a direct eyewitness to the act of killing. When they returned, the verdict was a strange mixture of certainty and stalemate. They found her guilty of 3 murders, among them the deaths of tenants like Leona Carpenter and Dorothy Miller, whose final days had followed the now familiar script of drugs, disappearance, and checks still being cashed. On 6 other counts, the jury deadlocked. One holdout juror, it was later said, could not bring herself to convict on every charge, no matter how strong the pattern looked. The death penalty was still on the table. In the penalty phase, the jury deadlocked again. In the end, the judge spared her from execution and sentenced her instead to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She went to the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. There, according to guards and occasional interviewers, she settled into a new routine, writing letters, maintaining that she was innocent, insisting that she had been misunderstood. She died in prison in 2011, at the age of 82. The house on F Street did not die with her. Today it still stands, repainted and remodeled, owned by people who live every day with the knowledge of what happened under their feet. Tour buses sometimes slow down in front of it. Ghost tours point at its windows. True crime fans take photos from across the street, trying to imagine the smell of that November dirt. If you walk past on a quiet evening, you might see warm light in the kitchen, someone cooking, the mundane rhythm of a normal life. You might think, if you did not know the story, that it looks like a safe place. That is the final horror of 1426 F Street. It never looked like a monster.